Senator Singh.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. This bill really has two main parts. The first part being the streamlining of the regulatory and reporting requirement. That part in itself, the opposition does give its support. However, the second part relates to the government's deregulation agenda in higher education, seeking to remove a range of requirements that affect providers and were largely introduced, in fact, by Labor when in government in response to the last time we had a major crisis in the international education sector following the collapses of colleges in particularly 2008-2009. And that is the part that the opposition does have grave concerns about and that we will move amendments to, and we ask the government to reconsider. When we do talk about the international education sector, the international education market, we do need to recognise the importance of quality, the importance of safeguarding that quality and having strict standards in relation to that quality. We know that this is an incredibly important part of our Australian economy. In fact, I understand it's something like second to coal and iron ore as being such an important part of our economy, worth some $18 billion a year to it. So over and above the economic benefits that we know the international education market has, we need to ensure that we as a country stand proud in what we do deliver and what we do provide. And that's why regulation is so important, because we know that there are those out there who unscrupulously will take advantage of any loophole they can find and offer dodgy courses which will lead, unfortunately, to the outcomes that we saw during the Howard era. I want to just draw to a little bit of history, though, when we talk about the safeguarding of overseas students who come to study in Australia. This idea of a single framework to safeguard overseas students was first introduced actually in the Hawke government in the form of the then Education Services for Overseas Students Act in 1991. So it has had quite some reform journey since that time, and quite rightly so, because we're not talking about an education sector that is static or a time period that is static. Regulations must change as circumstances must change. So perhaps the protections that were provided back in 2009 or in 2012 may not be appropriate for international students in 2016. And that is why the opposition takes a very constructive approach when we look at what is needed for the international student sector. This issue, though, of standards and of safeguarding quality, I have to say, Mr Acting Deputy President, is dear to my heart. I am the daughter of someone who migrated to Australia as an international student. It was the attractiveness of the standards and the quality education that Australia provided then in the 1960s, which made Australia a draw card for my father, as it did for so many other people, so many other overseas students at that time, and it has continued to be. Australia has been certainly right up there with a number of other countries in the world as a place to come and study and receive a quality education and a quality outcome in that process. But unfortunately, we have had some hiccups over the last number of years. And it is for those reasons that Labor stands very firm on the need to have safeguarding quality as a key to maintaining our high reputation when we talk about offering international students a pathway for their future. And why do we do that? Because if we value every human being as equal to ourselves, then we would want the same standards provided in higher education to those students coming from overseas to study here as we would want for ourselves. We would not want those students being exploited. We would not want those students to receive a watered down degree or have watered down protections in relation to the fees that they have paid and the educational outcomes that they have then received in return. And that is why this kind of ideological zeal that this government has in relation to deregulation is just so wrong-ended. It is completely wrong-ended because it's fine to want to reduce some red tape. We all understand that. We all understand the importance of streamlining something to make things easier and run more efficiently for students as well as for those education providers. But talking about deregulation, to me, speaks of weakening down those necessary and effective protections for overseas students that are needed now more than ever. We do not want in this place, and I'm sure I speak for all senators, a repeat of what occurred during the Howard era with all of those terrible scams that were put out through those colleges operating at that time, which, as we know, precipitated in a major economic crisis, but educational crisis, with the international education enrolments collapsing at that time. And I think it was, if we look back, an issue of naivety on behalf of the Howard government at that time, which, when Labor then came into government, had to fix up in a fairly major way. What we saw out of that, though, is between 2008 and 2011, 54 colleges collapsed, affecting 13,000 students, of whom only 312 got refunds from their educational institutions. Now, since that time, we've also, remember, there was a saga of Greenwich University, where a scam degree factory operated out of Norfolk Island, which the Howard government allowed to run rampant, I understand, for some 4 years. It was not only an example of dodgy practice, it was really quite a bizarre situation. I think that the efforts of all of the reputable providers who do strive, though, who do strive day in, day out to maintain high standards, treat students fairly and with dignity, are tainted, unfortunately, when there is some dodgy education provider in the mix. And that is a shameful thing when we know that there are so many good education providers out there whose reputations get damaged in the process. Unfortunately, there have been too many familiar stories in this space, though, and it is that concern that I certainly have. I know that Senator Lyons also touched on issues to do with the recent sham with contracting arrangements at 7-Eleven. Similarly, we saw that with Australia Post as well recently, with international students being exploited. I think that does expose, again, that even though we're aware of some of these cases, be it 7-Eleven, educational colleges, Australia Post, it raises the question, Mr Acting Deputy President, of how many scams or exploitations of international students we are not aware of, because this is only really what is being reported and what is being found out. We know that there could indeed be a number of reports that go hidden and in that sense left in a cloud of secrecy. So I do raise the importance of the additional comments that were provided in the Senate committee report on this bill. They went into some detail as to what Labor's position is, the fact that we do support the positive elements of this bill, but that we want the government to reconsider those provisions that we do not see as reasonable. Anything that is reasonable, of course we would support, but we do have that anxiety, as I mentioned, about the potential consequences of this deregulation agenda of this government. And if I can reiterate the position that both Senator Carr but also our Shadow Minister for Assistant Minister for Higher Education spoke of in the other place, that we are absolutely willing to do what is necessary in relation to reducing red tape. But what we don't want to see is the watering down of protections to international students, and indeed of those protections that would threaten international education, which, as I said earlier, is our biggest export, one of our biggest export industries. So we do reserve that right to make those amendments here in the Senate in that regard. Any harm, I think, to Australia's reputation as an education provider will really stem the increasing flow of students into this country and the flow of export income along with them. I'm sure the government understands the importance of that, if nothing else, the importance of this market to our bottom line in relation to our economy. And we know the freedom that's available to students globally now, that they do shop around and they do look at what is the best and most affordable education on offer to them. That, you know, Australia may not always be their first port of call, but we want them to make the choice about coming to Australia and being educated here on the basis of quality and on the basis of safety, on the basis that they are not exploited, that they are able to come here and live safely, comfortably, in a supported multicultural community, and come out of it at the end with a really decent quality education and an enjoyable experience that they had as a student whilst here. That is what we would want for our own sons and daughters if they were to travel overseas and study in another institution in another country, and I cannot see why we would not want anything less than that for international students coming here to Australia. So on the basis of that, Labor will support, in essence, the main first part of this bill, but we certainly will be moving amendments and making those reasons very clear in that in committee process as to why this bill is flawed in its second part. I think very much that we have shown over the years that we cleaned up the mess of the Howe government. We ensured that we didn't get a repeat of the collapse of this educational sector with the closure of those colleges, the necessary closure of course though, but the withdrawal of enrolments, collapsing of enrolments. We want to ensure we have a proud, well-functioning, properly regulated international education market in this country that continues to provide billions of dollars to our economy. The only way we will do that is by ensuring we do have good legislation with good regulations that help make that happen, and a positive attitude to our approach to international students in this country.
Thank you, Senator Singh.